The mist came first. Not the kind that rolls across fields at dawn, clean and brief, but something older, thicker, as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. It clung to the stones along the riverbank, pooled in the hollows between roots, and pressed against the water until even the current seemed reluctant to break its surface. He woke to silence. Ichigo lay flat on cold ground, his fingers still wrapped around the hilt of his blade. The weight was familiar. The world around it was not. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no city lights bleeding into the sky. Just darkness broken by a scattering of stars that looked closer than they should, sharper than they had any right to be. He pushed himself upright, joints protesting, and took stock. His shihakusho was torn along one shoulder, the fabric stiff with dried something he chose not to think about. Zangetsu rested beside him, its blade unblemished, despite whatever had brought him here. Wherever here was. The river ran maybe 30 paces ahead, wide and dark. On the far bank, trees rose like broken teeth against the horizon. Behind him, nothing but open ground stretching into shadow. No buildings, no roads, no people. Wrong. All of it wrong. He'd been in Hueco Mundo chasing down a hollow signature that had flickered across his senses like a dying ember. Then light. Then impact. Then here. Ichigo stood testing his weight on both legs. No brakes, no springs. Just the bone-deep exhaustion that came from burning too much spiritual pressure too fast. He reached out with his senses the way he'd learned to in Soul Society, feeling for Ryatsu signatures. Nothing. Not the empty nothing of a barren place. Something worse. Like trying to hear through walls that shouldn't exist. The spiritual energy here felt muffled, distant, operating on a frequency he couldn't match. He picked up Zangetsu, the familiar weight settling across his shoulders. If this was another dimension, another realm, then someone would know how to send him back. They always did. Find the right person, ask the right questions, get home. Simple. The wind shifted. With it came a smell that raised every nerve ending he had. Ash, old fire, and underneath that, something rotten like meat left too long in summer heat. Then he felt them. Not Ryatsu, not exactly. But pressure all the same bearing down from 3 points ahead, moving fast along the road that hugged the river's edge. The sensation crawled up his spine, cold and wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Ichigo's hand tightened on Zangetsu's hilt. They came into view moments later. 3 riders on horses that moved too smoothly, their hooves making no sound on the packed earth. Cloaks of absolute black hung from their shoulders, dragging behind them like oil spreading across water. Beneath the hoods, nothing. No faces, no light. Just emptiness that seemed to pull at the edges of his vision. The horses stopped at the ford's edge. The riders sat motionless, their attention fixed on something Ichigo couldn't see. Waiting. Then one of them turned its head toward him. The pressure intensified. Not pushing, but pulling like hands reaching into his chest and trying to pry something loose. Fear, he realized. They were projecting fear, weaponizing it, using it to freeze prey before the kill. Ichigo had faced worse. His own spiritual pressure flared in response, instinctive and sharp. The air around him contracted, then expanded, pushing back against the cold wrongness radiating from the riders. Grass bent away from his feet. The water at the ford's edge rippled backward upstream for just a heartbeat. All 3 riders recoiled. Their horses screamed, a sound like metal tearing, and reared back from the ford. The cloaked figures struggled to maintain their seats, their movements suddenly jerky, uncertain. One drew a blade that gleamed dull, even in the starlight, its edge notched and stained. Ichigo didn't think. He moved. He crossed the distance in a blink, movement folding space in a way the riders couldn't follow. Zangetsu swept up in a clean arc, the blade connecting with the nearest figure. Not flesh, not armor. Something in between, like cutting through smoke that had learned to hold a shape. The cloak split. Beneath it, the form twisted, fragmenting like reflection in broken glass. The rider's scream was worse than the horse's, a sound that had no business coming from anything with a throat. It didn't die. The pieces pulled together again, reforming several paces back, but slower now, hesitant. The other two had already wheeled their mounts around and were retreating, their cloaks streaming behind them like wounds in the air itself. Ichigo stood at the ford's center, blade still raised, watching them vanish into the darkness beyond the tree line. His breathing came hard, not from exertion, from the wrongness of what he'd just touched. Those things weren't hollows, weren't spirits, but they'd been cut, all the same hurt, by something that should only affect souls. What the hell was this place? Movement in his peripheral vision made him spin Zangetsu ready. A man stood at the road's edge, partially concealed by the shadow of a standing stone. Tall, lean, wearing a cloak of dark green that blended with the night. His hand rested on the hilt of a sword, but he hadn't drawn it. Yet. They watched each other for a long moment. The stranger's face was weathered, hard-lined, with eyes that reflected too much starlight. He looked like someone who'd spent years sleeping on cold ground and eating whatever he could kill. When the man finally spoke, his voice was low, careful. "The Black Riders do not flee." Ichigo kept his blade up. "They do now." The stranger's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in assessment. His gaze traveled from Ichigo's torn clothes to the oversized blade, to the way the grass still bent away from his feet, though the burst of spiritual pressure had faded. "You struck one of the 9. The man said, each word chosen with precision. "With a blade." And it withdrew. "Yeah." Ichigo lowered Zangetsu slightly, but didn't sheath it. "That a problem?" "It should be impossible." The stranger took a step forward, moving into the light. His features resolved, angular jaw, dark hair streaked with gray, a scar cutting through one eyebrow. He looked tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying weight no one else could see. "My name is Strider," he said, "and you are either the most dangerous thing I've encountered in 20 years or the most foolish." Ichigo met his gaze without flinching. "Ichigo. That is not a name from any land I know." "Yeah, well." Ichigo looked back at the ford, at the empty space where the riders had been. "I'm not from around here." Strider was quiet for a moment, his hand still on his sword hilt. Then slowly he released it, not relaxing, just recalibrating. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." A sound carried across the water from the far bank. Voices faint and panicked. Strider's head snapped toward them, his entire body going tense. "There are others," he said, already moving toward the ford. "Travelers. The riders were hunting them." Ichigo followed without thinking. If those things were hunting people, then those people needed help. Simple as that. They crossed the ford together, water barely reaching their ankles. On the far side, the voices grew clearer. 4 figures stumbled through the underbrush, supporting a 5th between them. Even in the darkness, Ichigo could see the fear on their faces, raw and animal. The smallest of them, barely reaching Ichigo's chest, clutched a bundle against his chest like his life depended on it. His eyes found Strider, and something like relief flooded his features. "Strider," the small one gasped. The riders? They were right behind us. We thought, they've withdrawn. Strider cut him off, his voice steady despite the urgency thrumming beneath it. He gestured toward Ichigo without looking away from the group. This one drove them back. All 5 turned to stare. Not with gratitude. With something closer to horror. Ichigo had seen that look before. Back in Karakura, when people caught glimpses of things they couldn't explain. When normal life brushed against something that made their instincts scream run. One of them, a man with a sword at his hip and the bearing of someone used to command, took a half step forward. His hand went to his weapon. Stand down. Strider's voice carried quiet authority. The man didn't move. What manner of creature drives back the 9? What manner of power? The kind that just saved your lives. Ichigo's voice came out flat. He was too tired for this, too confused, too far from anything that made sense. You're welcome. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the wounded one they carried. Up close, Ichigo could see the bandages wrapped around his shoulder, already soaked through with blood that looked black in the starlight. The smallest one spoke again, his voice shaking, but determined. We need to reach Rivendell. Frodo is hurt. The blade. I know. Strider's hand found the injured one's pulse, checking it with the efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine more times than he'd wanted to count. We move now. The riders will regroup. He looked at Ichigo, then really looked, weighing options with the speed of someone used to making choices with incomplete information. Come with us, Strider said. It wasn't quite an order, wasn't quite a request. Or don't. But if you stay here, the riders will return in force. And next time there will be more than 3. Ichigo looked at the wounded one, Frodo, whose face had gone pale as bone. Looked at the others, exhausted and terrified and holding themselves together through nothing but will. He'd been in enough fights to recognize the aftermath. These people had been running for days, maybe weeks. Whatever they carried, whatever they protected, it was worth dying for. And those shadow things would come back. Ichigo adjusted Zangetsu on his shoulders. Lead the way. They moved through the darkness like ghosts themselves, following paths only Strider could see. The wounded one drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing growing more labored with each mile. The others took turns supporting him, their small frames straining under his weight. Ichigo walked at the rear. His senses stretched as far as they go, despite the strange dampening effect of this place. Nothing moved in the shadows. No birds called. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. Hours passed. The sky began to gray at the edges. Dawn creeping in with the reluctance of something that knew what the new day would bring. Strider stopped at the crest of a hill, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. When Ichigo followed his line of sight, he saw it a valley nestled between mountains impossibly green, despite the encroaching autumn. And at its heart, buildings that looked like they'd been grown, rather than built, their architecture flowing with the contours of the land itself. Rivendell, Strider said quietly. The others seemed to sag with relief, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion. Even the wounded one stirred, his eyes opening to track the valley below. Ichigo felt nothing. No relief, no hope. Just the bone-deep certainty that whatever had brought him to this place, whatever had torn him away from his world and dumped him at that ford, it hadn't happened by accident. Something wanted him here. The thought settled in his gut like a stone. They descended into the valley as the sun finally broke over the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold that felt wrong after so much darkness. The buildings resolved into something closer to a city, though unlike any Ichigo had seen. No straight lines, no concrete. Just wood and stone arranged with the kind of precision that came from centuries of practice. People emerged to meet them, tall, impossibly graceful figures with eyes that seemed to hold too much light. They moved without sound, their attention immediately focusing on the wounded one, on the bundle he still clutched against his chest. And then, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade, came a voice that carried weight beyond its volume. "Bring him to the healing halls, quickly." The speaker stood at the head of a wide staircase, robed in deep blue that caught the light like water. His face was ageless in the way that spoke of centuries rather than decades, with eyes that swept across their group and stopped cold on Ichigo. For a moment that stretched too long, they stared at each other. Ichigo had the distinct impression of being examined, weighed, and found to be something that didn't fit into any existing category. The robed figure descended the stairs with deliberate calm, his gaze never leaving Ichigo's face. "I am Elrond," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested more than one conversation happening at once. "Lord of this realm. And you, stranger, are something I have never encountered in all my long years." Ichigo met his eyes without backing down. "Ichigo Kurosaki. And yeah, I get that a lot." Elrond's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. Not hostility, not welcome either, just acknowledgement that something unprecedented had arrived in his domain. "We will speak," Elrond said. "But first your companions need rest, and answers must be sought. You will remain as my guest." It wasn't a question. Ichigo looked at the wounded one being carried into the building at Strider, who stood watching with that same careful assessment at the valley around them that felt ancient in ways he couldn't articulate. He was trapped here, at least until someone could explain what here even meant. And if those shadow riders came back, these people would need every blade they could get. "Fine," he said. Elrond nodded once sharp and final, then turned to lead them deeper into Rivendell. As they walked, Ichigo caught the stares of others who'd gathered to watch. Not hostile, not friendly either, just wary the way people looked at storms on the horizon. He'd arrived at something, some moment that mattered in ways he didn't understand yet. And whatever came next, it would be written in the language this place understood best. Blood and choice. Rivendell didn't sleep. Not the way cities did, with darkness and quiet and the weight of hours passing. Here time moved differently, pooling in corners and stretching across courtyards like something alive. Ichigo felt it in his bones, the wrongness of a place where centuries layered on top of each other without collapsing. They'd given him a room. Stone walls, a narrow bed, a window that overlooked a courtyard, where water ran over rocks worn smooth by ages he couldn't count. Clean clothes waited on the bed, simple and well made, but he hadn't touched them. His shihakusho would do. He stood at the window watching the way light moved through the leaves below. No electric hum, no engines, just wind and water, and the occasional voice drifting up from paths he couldn't see. The language they spoke twisted in his ears, consonants and vowels that didn't match anything he'd learned in school or picked up in Soul Society. Except he understood it now. Not perfectly, not naturally, but enough. Elrond had done something. The night before, when Ichigo had been half collapsed in a chair while they tended to the wounded one, Frodo the Elf Lord had approached with a book. Old leather-bound pages, thin as skin. He'd opened it, placed it in front of Ichigo, and simply waited. The words on the page had meant nothing at first. Then gradually, like watching fog burn off a field, patterns emerged. Not translation. Something deeper. The shape of meaning underneath sound. Elrond hadn't spoken a word of explanation. just closed the book when Ichigo's eyes started tracking the letters with recognition. You learn quickly. Elrond had said the first words Ichigo had fully grasped in this tongue. That will matter. Now in the gray light before dawn, Ichigo tested the words under his breath. They felt wrong in his mouth, too many sounds that wanted to slide into each other. But they worked. Good enough. A knock at the door. Not loud, deliberate. Strider stood in the hallway when Ichigo opened it, looking less worn than he had at the ford, but no less guarded. He'd cleaned up, shaved, changed into clothes that suggested he belonged here more than his ranger's cloak had implied. "The council gathers at midday," Strider said without preamble. "Elrond has called the Free Peoples to decide the fate of what Frodo carries." Ichigo leaned against the doorframe. "And me. You will attend, as a witness, if nothing else." Strider's gaze was steady, assessing in the way of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading threats. "What you did at the ford, what you are, it cannot be ignored. I'm not here to join your war. You already have." Strider turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. When you stand before the council, do not lie. These people have walked this earth longer than your civilization has existed. They will know." The door closed. Ichigo stood alone again, the weight of those words settling like stone. The council met in a courtyard, open to the sky, ringed by pillars carved with patterns that hurt to look at too long. Chairs had been arranged in a loose circle, and people, if they could all be called that, filled most of them. Elves, tall and still as statues. Men weathered and armed. Dwarves shorter and broader, with beards that spoke of decades. And others, Ichigo couldn't place, beings that sat at angles to reality he couldn't quite track. No seat waited for him. He stood at the circle's edge, Zangetsu across his shoulders, aware of every eye that tracked his presence. Elrond sat at what might have been the head of the circle, though the arrangement suggested no hierarchy. Beside him, an old man in gray robes and a pointed hat leaned on a staff, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. The man studied Ichigo with the intensity of someone looking through flesh to see what lay beneath. "We are gathered," Elrond began, his voice carrying without effort, "to determine what must be done with the ring of power that has come into our keeping. But first, there is a matter that cannot be set aside." His gaze found Ichigo. 3 nights past the 9 were turned aside at the Bruinen Ford, not by spell or blade of our making, but by a stranger who wields power unlike any we have chronicled. He stands before us now. Silence fell, heavy, waiting. The old man in gray spoke next, his voice rougher than Elrond's, but no less commanding. "I am Gandalf. I have walked Middle-earth for longer than most here can remember, and I do not know you. That troubles me." Ichigo met his gaze without flinching. "Ichigo Kurosaki. And yeah, you wouldn't. I'm not from here." "Where then?" A dwarf spoke up, his voice like gravel grinding. "What land claims you?" "Not a land, a world." Ichigo kept his tone flat. "I don't know how I got here. 1 minute, I'm hunting hollows. Next, I'm waking up at your ford with those shadow things coming for someone." Murmurs rippled through the circle. Gandalf raised a hand, and they stilled. "Hollows," the wizard repeated, testing the word. "What are these creatures? Corrupted souls. Things that lost their humanity and started feeding on others." Ichigo shifted Zangetsu's weight. "I fight them. It's what I do. You fight the dead." Gandalf leaned forward, his knuckles white on his staff. "And your blade harms them." "Yeah." The Nazgul, Elrond said quietly, are neither living nor dead. They are wraiths bound to the will of Sauron through the power of the rings. No mortal blade can harm them. Mine did. The words hung in the air, undeniable, witnessed. A man rose from his seat, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of nobility and the eyes of someone used to command. The same one from the fort Ichigo realized, the one who'd reached for his sword. Then let him fight, the man said, his voice carrying conviction. If this stranger can harm the Nine, if his power is as great as witnessed, then he is a weapon we cannot afford to ignore. Send him with the ring-bearer. Let him cut down what stands in our path. Gandalf's expression darkened. You speak of power as if it were a tool to be wielded, without consequence, Boromir. We have seen where that path leads. So that was his name, Boromir, the man who saw him as a weapon. I speak of survival, Boromir shot back. Gondor stands alone against the darkness. If this one can turn the tide, he cannot. Elrond's voice cut through the rising argument like a blade through fog. Not as you envision. The Elf Lord stood, and the courtyard fell silent. The power this stranger wields is vast. Too vast. It does not merely push back the darkness. It announces itself. Every time he strikes, every time he releases what burns within him, it is a beacon. The eye of Sauron will turn toward it as surely as flame draws moths. Elrond's gaze found Ichigo's. If you travel with the ring-bearer, if you stand beside him, as he tries to move unseen through enemy lands, you will betray his presence with your very existence. The mission would fail before it began. Ichigo said nothing. The words landed like stones, each one true, in a way he couldn't argue against. Then what? Strider spoke from his seat, his voice measured. We send him away. Hope he finds his way home while war comes to our doorstep. No. Gandalf tapped his staff once against stone. We use him as he was perhaps meant to be used. Not as a blade walking beside the ring, but as something else. The wizard's eyes glinted with something that might have been calculation, or might have been hope. A wild card, Gandalf continued. Operating beyond the enemy's sight, beyond our plans. Where darkness gathers thick, where our path might break, he goes. Not tethered to the ring's fate, but parallel to it. He draws attention when we need distraction. He strikes when we need the enemy looking elsewhere. Ichigo felt his jaw tighten. They were talking around him, about him planning his life, like he was a piece on a game board. And if I say no? Every head turned. The question hung raw in the air. Elrond's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not threat, just acknowledgement. Then you will remain here as our guest until this matter is resolved one way or another. We cannot allow you to wander freely when your presence might draw Sauron's gaze to places we wish kept hidden. It is not imprisonment, but it is necessity. Ichigo's hand found Zangetsu's hilt, not in threat, just habit, grounding, trapped, either as a weapon they'd deploy when convenient or a prisoner they'd guard until the war ended. Neither option sat right. But he thought about Frodo, pale and bleeding from a wound that had nearly killed him. About the terror on those small faces when the riders closed in. About the way people here looked at shadows like they expected them to have teeth. Someone had to stand between them, and whatever was coming, that's what he did. What he'd always done. Just not the way they wanted. Fine, he said. I'll help, but not because you're telling me to. I do this my way. Gandalf's mouth twitched, almost a smile. I would expect nothing less. Elrond nodded, accepting. Then we shall speak more of how this will work. But first, the council must address the matter for which it was called. He gestured toward the center of the circle where a small table held something wrapped in cloth. Frodo stepped forward, still pale, but standing on his own, and unwrapped it with hands that shook slightly. A ring. Gold, simple, unremarkable, except for the way every eye in the courtyard fixed on it with a hunger that made Ichigo's skin crawl. The air changed, thickened, like pressure building before a storm, and for just a moment, Ichigo felt something looking back. Not at the ring, at him, through distance and stone and whatever walls separated worlds, a presence vast and malevolent and aware. Then it was gone, leaving only the ring and the people staring at it with expressions that ranged from reverence to horror. Gandalf began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of history. This is the One Ring, forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom. Ichigo stopped listening to the words. He watched faces instead. Watched the way they looked at the ring, like it could save them or damn them, or both. Watched the way some leaned forward, others leaned back. All of them caught in the gravity of a piece of metal that weighed more than mountains. This was their burden, their war, their choice. His was simpler. Keep people alive. Stand between them and what wanted them dead. Don't let the innocent become collateral. The council argued through the morning. Voices rose and fell, debating paths and strategies and the nature of hope itself. Ichigo remained standing at the edge, Zangetsu heavy across his shoulders, a stranger with no seat and no vote, but a promise made. All the same. When the council finally ended, when 9 had been chosen to carry the ring south, Gandalf approached him alone. "You will not walk with them," the wizard said quietly, "but you will walk for them. When they are hunted, you will hunt the hunters. When they are surrounded, you will break the siege. When darkness closes in, you will be the storm they never see coming." Gandalf's eyes held something that might have been sympathy. "It will be lonely, and it will ask more of you than glory ever does." Ichigo met his gaze. "How will I know where they need me?" "You will feel it, the same way you felt those wraiths at the ford. Malice leaves a trail for those who can sense it. Follow the dread. Follow the gathering dark. You will find your way." The wizard turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Ichigo Kurosaki. The power you wield, guard it carefully. Not from us, from yourself. This world has seen what happens when strength believes it can solve everything. The strongest blade still breaks if swung without thought." Then he was gone, leaving Ichigo alone in an empty courtyard as the sun climbed toward noon. Alone, but not directionless. The Fellowship would leave at dawn. He would leave before them, moving on a path parallel to theirs, hunting the things that hunted them. Not a guardian, not a soldier. Just someone who couldn't stand by while people died. Same as always. The mountain swallowed them whole. Ichigo had tracked the Fellowship's progress for 3 weeks across terrain that shifted between impossible beauty and exhausted desolation. He'd kept his distance, moving parallel to their path, feeling for the malice Gandalf had promised would guide him. The pull had been faint at first, scattered like trying to hear whispers through walls. Then they'd turned toward the mountains and everything changed. The dread thickened, gathered, became something with weight. Now he stood at the threshold of Moria, staring into darkness that pressed back against his senses like a living thing. The great doors had closed behind the Fellowship hours ago. No sound emerged from within, no light. Just stone and silence, and the certainty that something terrible waited in those depths. He'd tried the doors, solid, sealed. Whatever mechanism opened them from outside had locked when they closed. Breaking through would take time he suspected they didn't have. The wrongness emanating from the mountain. Well, my mountain had teeth now, sharp and hungry. Ichigo circled the mountain's base until he found what he needed. A crack in the stone, narrow and jagged, leading down into blackness. Old, probably older than the doors themselves. Big enough for a man if he didn't mind tight spaces and falling rock. He went in. The descent took hours. Stone scraped his shoulders. His back drew blood through fabric he'd stopped caring about days ago. The air grew thick, stale tasting of minerals and rot and something else. Something that made his spiritual pressure coiled tight in his chest, ready to explode outward at the first sign of threat. When the passage finally opened into a larger space, Ichigo dropped into darkness, so complete it felt solid. He landed in a crouch, Zangetsu already in hand, every sense screaming. Then he heard them. Voices. Familiar ones. Distant. Echoing through chambers and corridors that twisted sound into something alien. But unmistakably the Fellowship. And surrounding those voices, other sounds. Guttural. Snarling. The scrape of metal on stone. And the pad of feet that moved with pack intelligence. Ichigo ran. The tunnels of Moria twisted like intestines, each turn revealing new passages that branched into impossible geometries. Pillars rose from darkness into darkness, carved with patterns that suggested purpose, but revealed nothing. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped with the patience of centuries. And everywhere the weight. The sense of age pressing down stone, remembering things that should have stayed forgotten. He followed the sounds of combat, followed the spike of fear and defiance and desperation that cut through Moria's dead air like a wound. The chamber opened suddenly vast and pillared, lit by a phosphorescent glow that came from everywhere and nowhere. The Fellowship fought in its center, a tight knot of steel and desperation, surrounded by creatures that looked like nightmares, given flesh. Hunched forms with gray-green kin mouths full of teeth. Eyes that reflected the dim light like animals caught in firelight. Orcs. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds in the shadows beyond, waiting. Aragorn's blade moved in tight arcs, efficient and brutal. The elf Legolas fired arrows faster than Ichigo's eyes could track. The dwarf bellowed and swung an axe that split skulls with wet finality. And in the center, the small ones, the hobbits, clustered around Frodo with weapons they barely knew how to use, but wielded anyway. They were losing. Slowly. The orcs pressed from all sides, probing for weakness, testing defenses that grew more ragged with each exchange. Ichigo moved before thinking, his body already deciding what his mind would catch up to later. His spiritual pressure exploded outward. Not controlled, not measured. Pure instinct responding to the sight of people about to be overwhelmed. The air in the chamber compressed, then snapped back with force that sent the nearest orcs tumbling backward. Dust rose from cracks in the stone. The phosphorescent glow flickered and dimmed. Every head turned, Fellowship and orc alike all frozen in the sudden certainty that something new had entered the equation. Ichigo stepped into the light, Zangetsu raised, and the orcs closest to him scattered like leaves before wind. They knew instinctively what their small brains couldn't articulate. This was predator. This was death. He cut through them like paper. Zangetsu's blade moved in arcs that left trails of displaced air, each swing connecting with flesh that offered no resistance. Bone shattered. Blood sprayed black in the dim light. Screams rose and cut off and rose again from throats that learned too late what terror tasted like. The orcs tried to rally, tried to surround him, to drag him down through weight of numbers. They might as well have tried to hold back an avalanche with their hands. Ichigo moved through them like they were standing still, each step calculated, each strike ending a threat before it could form. Behind him, the fellowship regrouped. Aragorn barked orders, his tone sharp with shock and opportunity recognized. They pushed forward, breaking through the disarray Ichigo had carved into the orc formation, racing for an exit that had seemed impossible moments before. And then Ichigo felt it. Deep. Deeper than the tunnels. Deeper than the mountain. Something waking. Something vast and ancient and furious at being disturbed. The temperature spiked. Not gradually. All at once, like standing too close to a furnace that had just opened. The phosphorescent glow died completely, replaced by a different light. Orange, flickering, coming from somewhere below. Gandalf's shout cut through the chaos. "Run! All of you, run!" The wizard's face had gone white. Not with fear, with recognition. With the terrible understanding of someone who knew exactly what approached and exactly how badly things had just turned. The orcs fled, scattered into side passages and up walls, abandoning weapons and wounded in their desperation to escape. Even they knew. Whatever came now made them look like children playing at war. Ichigo held his ground blade ready, spiritual pressure coiling tighter. He'd faced monsters before, faced things that shouldn't exist by any reasonable standard. This would be the same. Had to be. Then it arrived. Not walking, rising, as if the floor itself had decided to become something else. Shadow and flame twisted together, forming a shape too large for the chamber, too wrong for reality. A form that hurt to perceive, like trying to look at something through heat haze while the heat was inside your skull. Horns, mane of fire, eyes that burned with light older than suns, and a presence that made the Nazgul feel like candles next to a wildfire. "Balrog," Gandalf's voice came hollow-aged beyond its years. A demon of the ancient world. The thing's attention swept across the chamber and stopped on Ichigo. Recognition flared in those burning eyes, not of him specifically, of what he was. Power meeting power, and finding the meeting unwelcome. It spoke, not in words, in flame and thunder that bypassed ears to burn directly into thought. A roar that said, "You woke me. You disturbed my sleep. You will burn for that presumption." Ichigo's hands tightened on Zangetsu. His spiritual pressure surged in response, automatic, preparing to meet the challenge. He could fight this. Had to. The fellowship was right behind him, trapped between the Balrog and whatever orcs remained in the tunnels beyond. A hand caught his shoulder. Old, but iron strong. "Gandalf." "No," the wizard said quietly, his words somehow cutting through the Balrog's roar. "This is not your fight." Ichigo started to protest, started to pull away. Gandalf's grip held. There are things in this world that cannot be fought with strength alone. Things that require sacrifice, understanding, time. The wizard's eyes burned with something fiercer than the flames behind them. "You wanted to protect them, then get them out. Now. And you. I will delay it. Simple, final. The tone of someone making a choice they'd already accepted the consequences for. The Balrog advanced. Each step shook stone. Each breath released heat that made the air shimmer and crack. It raised a weapon sword or whip both, and neither, and flame ran down its length like water. Aragorn grabbed Ichigo's other arm, pulling hard. He's right. We have to go. You can save them. Aragorn's face was stone-carved with the effort of not showing what abandoning Gandalf cost. That's what you do, isn't it? Save people. So save them. Now. The Fellowship was already moving half-running, half-stumbling toward a bridge that spanned a chasm Ichigo hadn't noticed before. Stone so old it predated memory, stretching over darkness that went down forever. Gandalf stood alone between the Balrog and escape. His staff came up. His voice rose, speaking words that made the air vibrate with authority. You cannot pass. Light flared, white against orange. Two forces meeting in a space too small for either. The chamber screamed. Aragorn dragged Ichigo backward, toward the bridge, toward safety, purchased with someone else's life. Every instinct in Ichigo's body howled against its scream to turn back, to fight, to refuse this arithmetic of sacrifice. But the hobbits were crying, scrambling across stone that crumbled beneath their feet. Frodo stumbled, nearly fell, caught himself on hands that bled from impact. Ichigo ran, not away from the fight, toward them. He scooped Frodo up without breaking stride, ignoring the hobbits' protests, and kept moving. The bridge stretched ahead, narrow and crumbling each step, sending chips of stone falling into the abyss below. Behind them Gandalf fought with magic older than kingdoms, with words that held back flames, with a will that refused to bend, even when the Balrog's whip lashed forward and wrapped around his legs. The wizard struck the bridge with his staff, once, twice. The stone beneath the Balrog's feet shattered. The demon fell, tumbled backward into darkness with a roar that sounded almost like surprise. And as it fell, the whip still coiled around Gandalf's ankle tightened. Pulled. Gandalf caught the bridge's edge with one hand. His staff clattered away, tumbling into the void. For a moment, just a moment, he hung there. His eyes found the Fellowship, found Frodo, found Ichigo. Fly, you fools. Then he was gone, falling into darkness and flame, his robes billowing like wings that couldn't save him. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Aragorn grabbed them all, physically pushing them forward. Move, the whole mountain is waking. They ran, through tunnels that shook and splintered past chambers where stone cracked and fell like rain, toward light that seemed impossibly distant. Ichigo ran with them, Frodo still in his arms, his mind stuck on that moment. That choice. He'd had the power to fight, to stay, to try. And Gandalf had told him no. They burst into daylight like drowning men breaking surface. Mountain air hit Ichigo's lungs clean and cold and tasting of snow. Behind them, Moria's entrance, collapsed stone grinding against stone, sealing the tunnels and everything they held. The Fellowship collapsed on grass still wet with morning dew. Some wept, some stared at nothing, all of them breathing like they'd forgotten how. Ichigo set Frodo down gently. The hobbit looked up at him, with eyes that had aged years in hours. You saved us, Frodo said quietly. In there. You cut through them like... He stopped, unable to finish. And woke that thing. Ichigo's jaw locked tight. My power. It called the Balrog. Gandalf died because I... No. Aragorn stood, his face carved from grief and iron will. Gandalf chose. He knew what needed doing and did it. That's not on you. But it was. Ichigo knew it in his bones. His spiritual pressure bursting out uncontrolled and massive had disturbed something meant to stay sleeping, had forced a choice that shouldn't have been necessary. Strength alone wasn't enough here. Gandalf had tried to tell him that. Power without thought, without understanding the consequences, just made things worse. He looked at Zangetsu, at the blade that had cut through orcs like they were nothing, and felt the weight of it differently. Not just metal and spiritual energy. Responsibility. Cost. The fellowship began moving again after an hour. Slowly. Heavily. Aragorn took point, his grief locked behind the mask of leadership they needed him to wear. The hobbits followed, supporting each other, their small faces empty of the joy they'd carried into the mountain. Ichigo walked behind them for a time, maintaining the distance Elrond had mandated. But the space between them felt different now. He'd been in that mountain, had fought beside them, had carried Frodo when the hobbit couldn't run. Aragorn glanced back once. Their eyes met. A moment of understanding passed between them. Not friendship, not trust, but recognition. They'd both lost something in those tunnels. Both learned that survival sometimes tasted like ash. When the fellowship made camp that night, Ichigo didn't approach. He found a ridge overlooking their position close enough to reach them, if danger came far enough to maintain the fiction of separation. He sat with Zangetsu across his knees and didn't sleep. Just stared at the blade and thought about an old man who'd stood between a demon and 9 people who needed time to run. Thought about power, and what it cost to use, and what it cost not to. The lesson settled into him like a stone dropped in deep water. Slow, heavy, permanent. This world would teach him whether he wanted to learn or not, or the fellowship broke at Amon Hen. Ichigo had watched from a distance as they argued, as Boromir reached for something he shouldn't have, as everything fractured along fault lines that had been forming since Moria. When the orcs came Uruk high, bigger and meaner than the twisted things in the mountain, he'd cut through enough to give the hobbits time to scatter. But he couldn't be everywhere at once. Frodo and Sam vanished into the eastern shore. Merry and Pippin were taken, dragged away by Uruks that moved with purpose instead of chaos. And Boromir fell with arrows in his chest, defending the hobbits until his body gave out. Ichigo had reached him in time to watch him die. To see Aragorn kneel beside him, to hear words exchanged that weren't meant for outsiders. When it was done, when they'd sent Boromir's body down the river in a boat that looked too small for the weight it carried, Aragorn stood and faced the choice. "We hunt the Uruks," he'd said, his tone allowing no argument. "We get Merry and Pippin back." Legolas and Gimli had agreed without hesitation. And Ichigo, still tasting ash from Moria, had nodded. Frodo had Sam. The hobbits taken had no one but these 3, and him. They'd run for 3 days across terrain that blurred together into endless grass and exhaustion. The Uruks moved fast, tireless, driven by orders that came from somewhere with enough authority to override their basic urge to kill and eat. Ichigo kept pace easily, too easily, his spiritual conditioning making mockery of distance, but held back to match the others. On the 3rd night, the voice came, not spoken aloud, not shouted across the plains. It arrived inside his head, smooth and cultured with the texture of silk hiding thorns. "Stranger, weapon without purpose, I would speak with you." Ichigo stopped mid-stride. Zangetsu came up automatically, spiritual pressure flaring in response to invasion. Around him, the others noticed his reaction. "What is it?" Aragorn's hand went to his sword. "Someone's in my head." Ichigo's jaw clenched. He'd dealt with telepaths before, hated it every time. The presence in his mind rippled with something that might have been amusement. Not someone. Saruman. And I am not in your head so much as adjacent to it. A courtesy, really. I could simply compel, but you strike me as the type who responds poorly to force. Get out. In a moment. First a question, what are you doing? The question landed wrong off-center, designed to make him defensive. Ichigo pushed back against the present spiritual pressure coiling tighter. Saving 2 kids from your pet monsters. Ah, how noble. The words dripped condescension. And after, when those children are returned to their homes, when this war grinds forward, as wars do, what then? You cannot return to your world. Cannot undo your presence here. So you follow men who use you as a blunt instrument, while calling it alliance. Ichigo said nothing. Let the silence stretch. Saruman continued smoother now. I offer clarity, purpose. Your power is wasted on escort duty and desperate rescues. Join me and I will show you how to use it properly, how to end this war before it consumes everything worth saving. By serving Sauron. A pause, brief, telling. By serving order. Sauron understands what these squabbling kingdoms refuse to see. Power must be centralized, controlled, directed toward purpose. The alternative is chaos wearing the mask of freedom. Ichigo had heard versions of this speech before. Back home from Hollows, who'd convinced themselves that eating souls was just natural selection. From Soul Society officers who thought the ends justified whatever means made them comfortable. He was tired of it. No. The presence shifted, hardened. You refuse without even... I said no. Get the hell out of my head before I make you. Saruman's laughter came cold and sharp. Make me child, you have no conception of what I am. What I could do to that fragile mind of yours, if I chose. But very well. Refuse. Chase your little hobbits. And when this war comes to your doorstep wearing fire and iron, remember I offered you the chance to stand on the winning side. The presence withdrew, leaving behind the mental equivalent of a door slamming. And in its wake, a sensation. Not quite a threat. More like a promise. Something was coming. Saruman spoke to you. Aragorn's statement, not a question. His face had gone hard. What did he want? Me, on his side. Ichigo shook his head, clearing the last echoes of invasion. Told him to get lost. Legolas's bow was already in hand, arrow knocked. Then he knows where we are. Knows we pursue his Uruks. Aye, Gimli spat. And he'll send more. Trap us between forces if he's clever. Aragorn looked west toward where Isengard squatted like a wound in the earth. His jaw worked. We keep moving. Faster. If Saruman wants to slow us down, he'll have to try harder than words. They ran, pushed through exhaustion into something beyond it, that place where the body moves because stopping means dying. The Uruk's trail grew fresher, more distinct. Close now. Maybe hours ahead instead of days. Then the ambush came. Not orcs this time. Uruks. The elite ones marked with the white hand of Saruman, bigger than the rest, and moving with coordination that spoke of actual training. They rose from a depression in the land where they'd been waiting 20 strong weapons already drawn. At their center stood something worse. Not an Uruk. A man. Or what had been a man before whatever Saruman had done to him. Armor black as char face hidden behind a helmet that showed only eyes burning with unnatural light. The wizard sends his regards. The thing said, its tone hollow. And his executioners. Ichigo didn't wait for them to attack. Didn't strategize or plan, just moved. But controlled this time. Focused. Moria had taught him something about restraint, about consequences. So when his blade came up, when spiritual pressure surged through his limbs, he kept it tight, directed, no wild release to shake the ground and wake things best left sleeping. The first Uruk died before it could raise its sword. The second lost its head mid-roar. Behind him, he heard Aragorn's blade sing, Legolas's arrows hiss, Gimli's axe crunch through bone and armor. But the armored thing moved faster than anything its size should. It caught Ichigo's next strike on a blade that rang like a bell, the impact sending feedback up his arms. Close now. Close enough to see that the eyes behind that helmet weren't human anymore, weren't anything. You should have accepted, it said, conversational despite the combat. The wizard would have made you useful. Yeah. Ichigo twisted, used the thing's momentum against it, drove Zangetsu through a gap in the armor near the shoulder. Tell him I'm plenty useful without his help. The blade bit deep. Should have crippled. Should have ended the fight. Instead, the thing laughed a sound like grinding metal and backhanded Ichigo hard enough to send him stumbling. Saruman's gifts are thorough, it said, pulling Zangetsu free with its good arm and tossing the blade aside like garbage. Pain is optional now. Ichigo called Zangetsu back to his hand-spiritual connection, pulling the blade through air faster than thought, and reassessed. This thing wasn't alive in any way that mattered. Wasn't feeling what it should. Whatever Saruman had done, it had turned a person into a weapon that couldn't be reasoned with or easily stopped. Fine. He could work with that. The next strike didn't aim for armor or flesh, aimed for the helmet itself, for the junction where metal met whatever passed for a neck. Zangetsu's edge found the gap and sheared through spiritual energy, cutting deeper than steel alone could manage. The helmet fell, and with it the light in those eyes died. The body collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, armor clanging hollow against earth. Around them, the last Uruks fell. Gimli's axe took one through the spine. Legolas put 3 arrows into another's chest faster than it could scream. Aragorn moved through them, like water through rocks, efficient and remorseless. When it was done, when 20 bodies lay cooling on grass, already soaked with their blood, the 4 of them stood breathing hard. None wounded seriously. All knowing this had been a warning shot. He'll send more. Legolas scanned the horizon, bow still ready. Worse than this. Let him. Aragorn wiped his blade clean. We're closer to Merry and Pippin than he is to stopping us. But Ichigo looked west again toward Isengard and felt something shift. Saruman had tried words, had tried force. Both had failed, which meant the wizard would escalate, would commit more resources, push harder, move faster. The war was accelerating, not because of grand strategy or careful planning, because one person had said no to a wizard's offer and made him angry. Butterfly effect. One choice rippling outward, changing timelines in ways no one could predict. They found the Uruks 2 days later, slaughtered by riders in the night. Merry and Pippin were gone tracks leading into a forest that seemed to breathe. And among the orc corpses, evidence of haste, of panic, of an army that had been moving in formation, suddenly breaking into chaos. Something happened here, Aragorn said, kneeling by churned earth. Something that scattered them. Gimli pointed toward the forest. The trees. They're closer than they should be. Moving, if my eyes don't deceive me. Fangorn. Legolas breathed equal parts wonder and wariness. The forest has awakened. They entered carefully, weapons ready but not raised. The forest accepted them, trees parting just enough to allow passage. Deep inside, they found the hobbits. Alive, unharmed, sitting on the shoulders of something that looked like a tree, had decided to become ambulatory. And nearby, in white robes that seemed to glow with their own light, stood Gandalf. Not dead. Not gone. Returned. The reunion was loud, joyful, impossible. Ichigo hung back, watching, processing. The wizard had fallen. Had died. And somehow had come back changed, upgraded, radiating authority that made the gray version seem like a shadow. When Gandalf's attention finally found him, those eyes, sharper now, brighter, held recognition that went deeper than memory. "You learned?" the wizard said simply. Not a question, not praise, just acknowledgement. Ichigo touched Zangetsu's hilt. "Still learning?" "Good." Gandalf turned back to the others, already beginning to organize, to plan. "Because the lessons are about to get harder. Saruman has shown his hand. War comes to Rohan within days, and we must be there when it arrives." Ichigo felt the weight of those words settle. War. Not skirmishes or ambushes or desperate chases. Actual war with armies and sieges and casualties counted in hundreds. He'd rejected Saruman's offer, had broken the wizard's toys and refused to bend. Now, he'd see what that cost. Rain came to Rohan like a punishment. Not the clean storms Ichigo remembered from home, brief and followed by sun. This was cold, relentless, the kind that soaked through fabric and settled into bone. It had been falling for 3 days by the time they reached the valley, turning roads into rivers of mud that sucked at boots and made every step a negotiation with gravity. The journey from Fangorn had taken weeks. Not the compressed time of stories where armies crossed continents overnight, but real distance measured in blisters and exhaustion and meals that consisted of whatever could be hunted or foraged. Ichigo had watched refugees stream past families with everything they owned tied to their backs, running from villages that Saruman's forces had already reached. Children with eyes too old, women carrying wounded husbands, old men who'd stayed to buy time with their lives so others could flee. The war had faces now. Not abstract concepts or military objectives, just people trying not to die. Helm's Deep rose from the valley like a fist of stone. Ancient fortifications carved into mountainside walls that had held against sieges for generations. It looked impenetrable, looked safe. Ichigo knew better. Nothing was safe when the enemy came in numbers that turned the horizon black. They'd arrived 2 days before the army. Time enough to see the preparations, the controlled panic as soldiers who'd spent their lives training for this moment realized training meant nothing compared to actual siege. Time enough to help evacuate the last stragglers, to watch families pushed into the caves behind the fortress where stone would protect them from everything except starvation, if the walls fell. Aragorn had pulled him aside on the second night, his face haggard from days without sleep. "When they come, you stay back," he'd said, each word deliberate. "Let the soldiers hold the line. Only intervene if the walls break, if they breach the gate. We can't afford what happened in Moria." Ichigo had understood, had nodded. But standing on those walls, now watching 10,000 Uruks march through rain like a slow-moving avalanche, he wondered if there'd be anything left to protect if he waited that long. The army stopped just beyond arrow range, not attacking, just standing there, letting the defenders see what approached, letting fear do its work. They were bred for war. Bigger than the Uruks Ichigo had fought before, armor thick and practical weapons maintained with the care of professionals. And behind them, siege equipment, ladders by the dozens, explosives wrapped in oilcloth, towers on wheels that would bring attackers level with the walls. This wasn't a raid. This was extermination. The soldier beside Ichigo was shaking. Young, maybe 17. His bow trembled in hands that hadn't yet learned how to be steady under pressure. "First time?" Ichigo asked quietly. The kid nodded, unable to speak. "Don't think about the army. Think about the guy next to you. Keep him alive. Let him keep you alive. That's all this is." A lie, but a useful one. The kid took a breath, steadied slightly. It would have to be enough. The Uruks charged at nightfall, no war cries, no shouted threats, just the sound of 10,000 boots hitting mud, moving in formation toward walls they intended to break or climb or simply overwhelm through mass. Rain hammered down harder, turning the battlefield into a nightmare of reduced visibility and treacherous footing. Arrows flew. Theirs and ours. Men screamed and fell. Uruks died by the dozen and kept coming, stepping over their own dead without pause. Ladders hit the walls. Grappling hooks caught stone. And Ichigo held position, zangetsu in hand, but not raised, watching soldiers fight and die while every instinct screamed at him to move. The first breach came at the southwest tower. A section of defenders overwhelmed by Uruks, who'd climbed 3 ladders simultaneously, pouring onto the wall faster than arrows could thin them. They pushed inward, carving through the line opening space for more to follow. Ichigo moved. Not a full release, not the overwhelming burst that had woken the Balrog. Controlled, precise. Just enough spiritual pressure to enhance speed and strength without rattling the mountain. He crossed 30 yards of wall in seconds. Zangetsu coming up in a horizontal arc that caught the lead Uruk across the chest. The blade bit through armor that should have stopped it through flesh and bone, separating torso from legs. The Uruk behind it tried to adjust, tried to bring its weapon to bear. Ichigo was already past it, already cutting through the next 3, creating a corridor of falling bodies that gave the defenders room to regroup. 20 seconds. That's all it took. 20 seconds of movement so fast, the human eyes struggled to track at it, and the breach sealed. The Uruks on the wall died or fell back down their ladders. The defenders rallied, pushing forward to reclaim lost ground. But the soldiers who'd seen it stared at Ichigo like he'd grown a second head. Not with gratitude. With something closer to horror. He'd saved them, and they looked at him like he might be worse than what they'd been saved from. The siege ground on through the night. Hours that felt like days, each wave of Uruks slightly different from the last, as Saruman's commanders adjusted tactics. They tried the gate with a battering ram, tried explosive charges at weak points, tried sheer weight of numbers at multiple locations simultaneously. Aragorn directed the defense with brutal efficiency, his commands sharp and immediate. Legolas burned through arrows faster than seemed possible, each shot finding a throat or eye. Gimli held a section of wall through sheer bloody-minded refusal to give ground, and Ichigo plugged holes. When a ladder breach threatened to cascade into collapse, he was there. When explosives blew a chunk of wall and Uruks poured through the gap, he sealed it with steel and speed. Never more than necessary, never less than what survival demanded. But each intervention cost something. Not from him, from the people he saved. He saw it in their faces afterward. The way they'd look at him, then look away. The way they'd cluster together when he passed, speaking in low tones that cut off when he got too close. The way even gratitude tasted like ash because it came wrapped in fear. They didn't trust him, didn't know what he was or where his loyalties truly lay. Just knew that he killed in ways that made veteran soldiers look like children playing at war. The critical moment came 3 hours before dawn. The deeping wall, the massive outer fortification that protected the fortress proper, had held against everything thrown at it. Until the Uruks ran a chain of explosives along its base packed with enough force to crack foundations that had stood for centuries. The explosion lit the night like day. Thunder rolled through the valley, echoing off mountains. And when the smoke cleared, a breach 30 feet wide gaped in the wall rubble, still tumbling into the gap. Uruks poured through, hundreds, streaming toward the inner fortress where civilians huddled in caves and exhausted soldiers held a line that was already breaking. Aragorn's shout cut through the chaos. "Hold the breach! Hold, or we're lost!" But there weren't enough soldiers, weren't enough arrows, weren't enough anything except enemies that kept coming and a gap that kept growing as more Uruks forced their way through. Ichigo ran toward the breach, not thinking, not calculating, just seeing people about to be slaughtered and refusing to let it happen. His spiritual pressure exploded outward as he hit the gap. Not Moria level, not enough to wake ancient things, but enough. Enough to make the air itself recoil. Enough to send the front line of Uruks stumbling backward. Zangetsu sang. He didn't remember the details later, couldn't have recounted the specific strikes or the number of enemies that fell. Just knew that when clarity returned, he stood in the center of the breach, surrounded by bodies, rain washing blood from his blade in streams that ran red between broken stones. The Uruks had stopped advancing, stopped trying to force through. They stood at the breach's edge, weapons ready, but none willing to be first to tempt whether he could do it again. Behind him, Rohan soldiers rushed to fortify the gap, dragging rubble into place, forming a new line using the corpses as barricade. Practical, grim, necessary. One of them passed close enough to speak. Older, scarred. The kind of veteran who'd seen enough war to recognize different breeds of violence. "We're grateful," he said, his tone flat. "Don't mistake that. But gods help us, what are you?" Ichigo had no answer, so he said nothing, just turned back to watch the Uruks, to wait for them to decide whether fear or duty would win. Dawn broke before they could resume the assault. And with dawn came horns from the north. Riders, thousands of them sweeping down from high ground where they'd been gathering through the night. Gandalf rode at their head, white robes, brilliant against gray sky staff, raised like a banner. Behind him, Éomer led the Rohirrim in a charge that hit the Uruk rear with the force of an avalanche. The siege broke, not slowly, catastrophically. Uruks trapped between the fortress and cavalry scattered, trying to reform, trying to fight on two fronts and failing at both. Within an hour, it was over. The field belonged to Rohan, purchased in blood and exhaustion, and the kind of desperate fighting that left survivors wondering why they'd survived when so many hadn't. Ichigo stood on the shattered, deeping wall and looked at what victory meant. Bodies everywhere. Rohan soldiers, Uruks, horses, all mixed together in the mud and rain until it was hard to tell which side any particular corpse had fought for. The kid from the wall, the one who'd been shaking before the battle, sat nearby, staring at nothing. Alive, physically intact. But something in his eyes had changed, aged, broken in ways that wouldn't heal. They'd won, the fortress held, Saruman's army destroyed. By every military metric, this was success. It tasted like shit. Aragorn found him an hour later, limping from a wound he'd taken some time during the night and hadn't mentioned. The ranger looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. "You kept the breach," Aragorn said simply. "Without that, we'd have lost everything." "Yeah. The men fear you. You know that." "I know." Aragorn was quiet for a moment, his attention on the field below. "They'll get over it. Or they won't. Either way, they're alive to feel fear. That's worth something." Maybe. Ichigo wasn't sure anymore. He'd thought saving people would feel cleaner than this. Thought winning battles meant something beyond temporary reprieve before the next one. But the bodies piled up regardless, and the war kept grinding forward, consuming lives with the efficiency of a machine designed for exactly that purpose. Gandalf approached from the fortress, his staff clicking against stone with each step. The wizard's face was grave-aged by more than the night's fighting. "Saruman is broken," he announced. "Isengard will fall, if it hasn't already." But this was only one front. The true war moves east toward Gondor, toward Minas Tirith. He fixed Ichigo with a stare that seemed to see through flesh to whatever lay beneath. "What you did here saved countless lives. Remember that when doubt comes. But also remember, this is what war looks like when it's won. Imagine what it looks like when it's lost." The wizard turned to leave, then paused. "Gondor will burn brighter than this, and you will be there when it does." Not a request, not even a prediction. Just certainty spoken like gravity. Ichigo looked at Zangetsu, at the blade that had cut through so much and solved so little. Looked at the battlefield that stretched below, at the living and the dead sharing the same mud. He'd come to Middle-earth by accident. Had fought because he couldn't stand watching people die. Had learned that strength without wisdom just made better corpses. And now he was being told the worst was still coming. Fine. If Gondor was next, he'd be there. Would stand between the fire and whoever needed standing between it and them. Same as always. Even if it tasted like ash. Even if the people he saved looked at him like he was the monster. Someone had to stand. Might as well be him. Minas Tirith burned. Not with flame. Not yet. But with smoke and ash, and the constant percussion of siege engines hurling stone into walls that had stood for centuries. The white city glowed wrong in the dying light, its marble stained with char and blood, its banners torn by wind that carried screams from the lower levels. Ichigo had reached Gondor 3 days after Helm's deep riding hard with Aragorn and a company of rangers who moved through wilderness like ghosts. They'd arrived to find the city already under siege, surrounded by forces that made Saruman's army look like a skirmish. This was Sauron's full attention. Everything the Dark Lord could marshal concentrated on breaking the last kingdom that stood between him and total dominion. Orcs by the tens of thousands. Trolls in formation. Siege towers tall enough to reach the 3rd level. And above it all, circling like carrion birds, waiting for death, the Nazgul. Ichigo felt them before he saw them. That same cold pressure from the ford, multiplied by 9, pressing down on the city like a physical weight. Fear made manifest. Terror weaponized and deployed with surgical precision. They screamed as they dove, not words. Pure malice translated into sound that bypassed ears to scrape directly against the soul. Men on the walls dropped their weapons and wept. Soldiers with decades of experience froze, unable to move, unable to do anything except feel the certainty of their own deaths approaching. The city was breaking, not its walls, its will. Aragorn had entered through passages known only to rangers, bringing Ichigo with him. They'd fought their way up to the highest level where Denethor ruled or had ruled before grief and despair had turned him into something hollow. The steward sat on his throne, staring at nothing, while his city died around him. "He's lost," Gandalf had said grimly, standing in the throne room like an accusation made flesh. Sauron showed him visions through the Palantir, showed him our defeat, made him believe surrender was mercy. "Can you break it?" Aragorn had asked. "No, but we can buy time, if the Rohirrim arrive, if the field can be held long enough. If. The entire war balanced on a word that meant hope and impossibility in equal measure. The gate fell on the third day, not through siege engines or sapping. Through Grond, a battering ram the size of a building forged in the image of a wolf's head and carried by mountain trolls. Each impact shook the entire city. Each strike sent cracks spreading through stone that had never known defeat. When the gate shattered, when splinters of ancient oak flew like shrapnel through the courtyard, beyond the army of Mordor howled. One voice. 10,000 throats. The sound of certainty that victory had arrived. Trolls poured through to unfurl their bulk, clearing space for the orcs behind. Defenders tried to hold the courtyard, forming lines that dissolved under the weight of enemies that had forgotten how to stop. This wasn't battle. This was drowning on dry land. Ichigo stood on the second level watching it happen. Watching men die, buying seconds that added up to nothing. Watching the city's heartbeat falter. Gandalf appeared beside him, robes billowing despite the absence of wind. The wizard's face was stone. "Now," he said simply, "give them time. Make them remember fear flows both ways." Ichigo jumped, fell 2 stories to the courtyard below, landing in a crouch that cracked stone beneath his feet. His spiritual pressure detonated outward uncontrolled for the first time since Moria. Not because he'd forgotten restraint, because restraint wouldn't save anyone here. The blast wave hit like a hammer made of air. Orcs closest to him tumbled backward, their formations shattering. A troll mid-swing froze its tiny brain, recognizing predator, but unable to process how something so much smaller could feel so much more dangerous. Zangetsu came up, and Ichigo stopped, holding back. He moved through them like water through cracks. Each step covered distances that made physics weep. Each swing of his blade opened spaces in flesh and bone, creating corridors of death that gave defenders room to retreat, to regroup, to remember they still had weapons and will to use them. The first troll fell in 3 cuts. Head, chest, legs. It toppled like a tree, crushing orcs beneath its bulk. The second tried to grab him, lost the arm that reached. Then the other, then found Zangetsu's point through its throat. Orcs died. Not ones or twos. Dozens, scores, their bodies piling up faster than their companions could process, creating a barrier of corpses that slowed the advance, that turned momentum into hesitation. And above it all, the Nazgul noticed. 3 of them broke from their circling pattern, their fell beasts, banking hard toward the courtyard. Toward him. Their screams intensified, targeting, focusing all that weaponized despair on the single point that had disrupted their master's perfect assault. Ichigo had fought them before at the ford, had learned they were wraiths, spirits bound to Sauron's will through rings of power. Learned that his blade could hurt them when nothing else could. But he'd never fought 3 at once. Had never faced them when they weren't testing, but hunting. The first one dove at him from directly above its mount's claws, extended to rend and tear. Ichigo waited until the last possible moment, until he could see the rot on those talons, smell the decay that clung to both rider and beast, then launched himself upward. Spiritual energy propelled him like a rocket. He passed the beast blade, extended Zangetsu's edge, catching the Nazgul across where its chest should have been. The wraith shrieked, the sound transcending pain to become something worse. Its form flickered fragments of darkness, peeling away like ash in wind. The beast, masterless for a crucial second, spun out of control. Crashed into the second Nazgul's mount, tangling wings and claws, both spiraling toward Earth in a chaos of shrieks and impact. Ichigo didn't watch them fall. The third was already on him, its blade, a thing of corroded iron and malice, swinging for his neck. He caught it on Zangetsu, the impact sending vibrations up his arms that felt wrong, tainted like the metal itself carried disease. They hung there for a moment, blade locked against blade, suspended 20 feet above the battlefield by nothing but will and momentum. The Nazgul's hood turned toward him, and though no face existed within Ichigo, felt its attention like ice in his chest. It spoke, not aloud, directly into his mind. "You are seen." The words carried weight beyond their simplicity, carried the certainty of a door opening, of attention turning, of something vast looking directly at him. For just an instant, Ichigo felt it. The eye. Not metaphor, not symbol. An actual presence awareness so massive it made the Nazgul feel like shadows of shadows, focusing through distance and stone, and whatever barriers separated this world from Mordor proper. Seeing him, knowing him, filing him away as a problem to be solved. Then it was gone, attention withdrawing as quickly as it had come. But the mark remained, like a brand, like a targeting sigil burned into his soul. Ichigo twisted, broke the blade lock, and drove Zangetsu through the Nazgul's torso. The wraith screamed again, its form destabilizing the coherence that held it together, unraveling. It fell trailing darkness like blood, its mount following in a death spiral that ended with both slamming into the courtyard stones. Ichigo landed beside the impact, breathing hard. 3 Nazgul engaged, 2 disabled, 1 dispersed, but not destroyed. Around him, Gondor's soldiers stared with expressions he'd seen before at Helm's Deep. Fear, gratitude, horror, all mixed into something that made them step back, even as they cheered. But the orcs had stopped advancing. The trolls had paused. Something in their limited intelligence recognized that the calculus had changed, that pushing forward meant walking into a grinder that cared nothing for their numbers. The reprieve lasted minutes. Long enough for defenders to shore up positions. Long enough for the wounded to be dragged back. Long enough for Ichigo to realize his hands were shaking. Not from exertion, from the lingering sensation of that attention, that gaze. He'd been marked, tagged, put on a list of things that needed to be eliminated before they became real problems. Horns shattered the moment. From the north, from the fields beyond the city. A sound that carried hope like a physical force. The Rohirrim had arrived. 6,000 riders crested the ridge at full gallop sunlight, catching on spears and armor, turning them into a wave of steel and fury. At their head rode King Theoden, his banner streaming his voice, rising in a cry that made even orcs pause to listen. Ride, ride now. Ride for ruin and the world's ending, death. Death. 6,000 voices answered. They hit the orc formations like thunder. The charge broke through lines that had seemed unbreakable, scattered forces that had been methodically destroying the city. Chaos replaced order. Fear reversed its flow. Ichigo watched from the courtyard as the tide turned, as hope returned, as the impossible became merely unlikely. Then the Witch King arrived. The lord of the Nazgul descended from smoke and shadow on a fell beast larger than the others, more ancient, more terrible. Its presence alone sent waves of despair rolling across the field. Men who'd been fighting moments before dropped their weapons and ran. Horses screamed and threw their riders. It flew straight for Theoden, for the king who dared to bring hope to a hopeless battle. Ichigo moved to intercept, started running toward where the Witch King would land, spiritual pressure building, ready to engage. A hand caught his arm. Aragorn appeared from somewhere, his grip iron. "No," the ranger said, his tone absolute. "Not this one. This moment belongs to someone else. He'll die. Maybe. But this is prophecy. This is fate moving. You step in now, you break something that was meant to happen." Ichigo wanted to argue, wanted to say he didn't care about prophecy or fate or any of it when someone's life hung in the balance. But he'd learned. Moria had taught him about waking things better left sleeping. Helm's Deep had taught him that power without wisdom just made better corpses. And now Aragorn was teaching him that sometimes the best thing a blade could do was stay sheathed. So he watched the Witch King land before Theoden. Watched the king stand defiant even as his horse fell dead from terror. Watched a figure step between them, small armored, facing down a demon of the ancient world with a sword that seemed laughably inadequate. Éowyn, Theoden's niece, who'd ridden to war disguised as a man because no one would let her defend what she loved. The Witch King raised its blade, spoke words that promised death and worse, and she struck, not with power that shook the earth, not with force that announced itself, just with courage and steel and the certainty that some things were worth dying for. Her blade found the gap between helm and neck, found the space where even wraiths needed connection. And the prophecy that no man could kill him proved meaningless when faced with a woman who'd stopped asking permission to matter. The Witch King fell. Not gradually, all at once. The coherence that held him together for millennia unraveled in seconds, his form dissipating into nothing, leaving only armor and weapons that clattered hollow against stone. The battlefield froze, both sides stunned by what they'd witnessed. Then the Rohirrim roared. Then Gondor's soldiers answered. Then the tide didn't just turn, it shattered. Aragorn released Ichigo's arm. That is why you waited. Ichigo stood silent, watching Éowyn collapse beside the armor of her kill, watching Theoden die with his final breath spent on pride for his niece, watching victory and loss coexist in the same moment because war didn't care about clean endings. He'd killed so much today, cut through enemies like harvesting wheat, made space for others to live. But he hadn't done that, hadn't given someone the chance to matter in the way that would be remembered when the wars ended and the stories began. Strength could break armies, could scatter enemies, could buy time measured in lives saved. But it couldn't give meaning to sacrifice, couldn't make someone's death matter beyond the tactical, couldn't turn loss into the kind of victory that echoed through generations. The battle raged on through the afternoon, but the outcome was decided. Without the Witch King, without the concentrated terror of the Nine, Mordor's army broke. Not all at once, gradually, but inevitably. By evening, Pelennor fields belonged to the living. At a cost counted in thousands, at a price paid in full. Ichigo sat on rubble that had been part of the outer wall, cleaning blood from Zangetsu with a rag someone had given him. Around him, soldiers moved through the aftermath, binding wounds, collecting dead, doing the work that came after fighting stopped. Gandalf found him there as the sun set, painting everything in shades of orange that looked too much like fire. "You were seen," the wizard said without preamble. "The Eye knows you now. Fully, completely." "Yeah, I felt it." "Good. Because what comes next requires that attention. Requires Sauron to be looking at you instead of elsewhere." Gandalf's staff tapped stone once, sharp, final. "Tomorrow we march to the Black Gate, not to win, to draw every eye, every spear, every thought Sauron possesses. While he watches us die, 2 hobbits will be climbing a mountain." The wizard's eyes held something that might have been apology or might have been respect. "You wanted to protect them. This is how. Stand at the Black Gate and be the storm Sauron cannot ignore." Ichigo looked at the field, at the bodies, at the city behind him that had held because enough people had been willing to stand. One more battle, one more wall between people and death. "When do we leave?" "Dawn, with every soldier who can still march." Ichigo nodded, sheathed Zangetsu, stood. The Eye had seen him, had marked him as a threat. Good. Let it watch him march straight into its teeth. Let it commit everything to crushing this army. While Frodo and Sam did what they'd always been meant to do. End it. The Black Gate stood like a wound in the earth. 2 towers of iron and malice rose from barren ground, connected by a gate large enough to march armies through. Behind it, Mordor sprawled a wasteland of ash and lava and things that had forgotten what life meant. The air tasted of sulfur and despair. Even breathing felt like surrender. 7,000 men stood before it. Not an army, a declaration. A challenge issued to a power that could crush them without effort if it chose to engage directly. Ichigo stood near the front, close enough to see the gate's rivets, close enough to feel the wrongness radiating from Mordor, like heat from a furnace. Around him, soldiers checked weapons with hands that shook despite their best efforts. Veterans who'd survived Pelennor fields now faced something worse. Not a battle they might win. A sacrifice they'd already accepted. Aragorn had addressed them before they marched. Told them the truth, because lies wouldn't serve here. Told them they rode to die so others might live. Told them history would remember this moment when all others faded. Some had wept. Some had laughed. All had come anyway. The gate opened. Not slowly. All at once, iron shrieking against iron, the sound carrying across dead land like a scream. And through that opening poured an army that made Pellennor's forces look like a scouting party. Orcs, tens of thousands. Trolls in armor, Easterlings with curved blades. Haradrim on Oliphant's war beasts the size of buildings' tusks, decorated with the bones of previous victims. All moving with the coordination of forces that knew victory was guaranteed. They didn't charge, didn't rush forward in bloodlust, just advanced, methodical, professional. The march of inevitability given form, and above it all, circling the towers like sharks, scenting blood, the remaining Nazgul. 6 of them, their presence alone enough to make grown men soil themselves. Their screams cutting through the air in waves that turned courage into ash. Gandalf's staff came down hard. White light flared, pushing back against the psychic assault. But even his power had limits. Even he couldn't shield 7,000 minds from concentrated malice. Aragorn drew his sword. Andúril caught what little light remained, reflecting it back toward the army that approached. "Hold positions, let them come to us." But Ichigo felt it already. The pressure, Not from the army, not from the Nazgul. From the eye itself, he'd been marked at Pelennor, tagged as a threat to be eliminated. Now that attention focus sharpened, became something with weight and intent. Like being watched by a god who'd decided you were a problem worth solving personally. The pressure built behind his eyes, in his chest, a sensation like hands closing around his heart and squeezing. Not pain. Worse. The absolute certainty that he was nothing, insignificant, a mote of dust before a hurricane. Give up. The thought arrived from nowhere and everywhere. Lay down your blade, accept the inevitable. You cannot stand against eternity. Ichigo's hands tightened on Zangetsu. His spiritual pressure coiled in response, instinctive, pushing back against the intrusion. The eye noticed. The pressure intensified, tripled, became a vice that threatened to crack his skull from inside. Images flooded his mind, his world burning. Everyone he'd ever protected dying, screaming. Himself standing alone in a wasteland of his own, making blade in hand surrounded by corpses of those he'd failed. Not real. He knew that. Knew it was psychic warfare, the eye trying to break him before the battle even started. But knowing didn't make it stop. Blood ran from his nose, his vision blurred. Around him, soldiers began to notice backing away as spiritual pressure leaked from his control, making the air shimmer and crack. Gandalf's hand found his shoulder. The wizard's touch burned like ice, shocking clarity back into his thoughts. Now, Gandalf said quietly, show him what you are. Make him commit everything to crushing you. Ichigo understood. This was the plan. Be the beacon, be the target, draw every eye, every spear, every thought Sauron possessed. While Frodo climbed a mountain, no one was watching. He released everything. His spiritual pressure exploded outward in a sphere of force that sent dust spiraling away from him in waves. The ground cracked beneath his feet. The air itself screamed as reality bent around energy that had no business existing in this world. The Nazgul recoiled. Their fell beasts banked hard away from the epicenter instinct, overriding orders as they fled from something their limited comprehension couldn't process. The advancing army hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough to recognize that calculation had changed. And in Mordor, in the dark tower itself, the eye turned. Fully. Completely. Every fragment of Sauron's attention focusing on this single point, this anomaly, this thing that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world of conquest. Ichigo felt it like being crushed under a mountain. The full weight of an immortal intelligence bearing down, trying to understand, to categorize, to eliminate. He raised Zangetsu and charged. Not toward the gate. Toward the army that outnumbered his side 100-1. Straight into the teeth of forces designed to grind nations into dust. Behind him, Aragorn's voice rose. With him for Frodo. 7,000 throats answered, not with hope, with defiance, with the certainty that if they were dying today, they'd die on their feet with weapons in hand. The armies met like thunder. Ichigo cut through the front line in seconds. Zangetsu moved faster than eyes could follow, each swing opening wounds in formations that had seemed impenetrable. An orc lost its head, a troll its legs. An Easterling found himself bisected before his brain registered the blade had moved. But there were too many. For every enemy that fell, 3 more stepped forward. For every gap he carved, the army flowed around it like water around stone. He didn't care, wasn't trying to win, just needed to be visible, needed to be the thing Sauron couldn't ignore. The eye's attention intensified, not trying to break him anymore, trying to understand. What are you? Where did you come from? How do I erase you from existence? Each question came with force behind it. Psychic pressure that made his ears bleed, made his hands shake, made breathing feel like drowning. The visions returned, stronger now, more detailed, showing him everyone he'd failed to save. Everyone who died because he wasn't fast enough, strong enough, smart enough. Showing him Gandalf falling in Moria, Boromir dying with arrows in his chest, the kid at Helm's Deep who'd survived the battle but lost something in his eyes that would never return. This is what your strength purchases. Death wearing different faces. You save no one. You only choose who dies when. Ichigo stumbled. An orc's blade caught his shoulder, drawing blood. Another slashed across his ribs. Pain registered distantly, filtered through the greater agony of having his mind filleted. Around him, Gondor's soldiers held the line. Aragorn fought like a man possessed, Andúril reaping lives with each swing. Gimli's axe never stopped moving. Legolas burned through arrows in a rhythm that seemed impossible to maintain. But they were losing. Slowly. Inevitably. The math was simple. 7,000 against 100,000. Courage couldn't change arithmetic. The Nazgul returned emboldened by their master's focus. They dove in coordinated strikes, targeting Ichigo specifically. Their blades whistled past his head, their mount's claws raking his back. He caught one mid-dive. Zangetsu's edge found its throat, sent it spiraling away, shrieking. But three more immediately took its place. This was the endgame. The moment where everything balanced on a knife's edge. They couldn't hold, couldn't retreat, could only stand and bleed and hope it was enough. The eye's pressure peaked. Not questioning anymore, commanding, kneel, submit, accept that your struggle is meaningless. Ichigo's knees buckled, hit stone. Blood ran from his eyes now, from his ears, from wounds he couldn't remember taking. Zangetsu felt heavy as a mountain. His spiritual pressure guttered like a candle in wind. He'd pushed too hard, released too much. The eye had found every crack in his defenses and was methodically breaking him apart. But he'd done it. Had held Sauron's complete attention for minutes that felt like hours. Had made himself impossible to ignore. Behind the lines, Gandalf watched with an expression carved from stone and hope in equal measure. Waiting, watching, waiting for something only he could sense. An orc raised its blade above Ichigo's head, ready to end it, ready to claim a kill it would never understand the significance of. The blade started to fall, and then the world stopped. Not literally, not completely, but something shifted. Something vast and fundamental tore loose from its moorings. The eye's pressure vanished. All at once, like a dam breaking in reverse attention, snapping away from the black gate towards something else. Something worse. Mount Doom erupted, not with lava, with light, with fire that burned wrong, unnatural, the color of nightmares given physical form. The mountain shook, the ground beneath everyone's feet rippled like water. And from Barad-dûr came a sound that had no business existing in reality. A scream. Not of pain, of loss, of something fundamental being torn away. Sauron's scream. The Nazgul fell from the sky, not shot down, not defeated in combat, just felled their connection to their master, severed their existence predicated on something that no longer existed. They tumbled like broken dolls, their mounts following, both turning to ash before they hit the ground. The army of Mordor froze. Orcs dropped their weapons. Trolls stood confused. Easterlings looked at each other with expressions that asked questions no one could answer. Then they ran. Not retreated. Not withdrew. Ran. Scattered in every direction like animals fleeing fire. The army that had been an unstoppable force moments before dissolved into panicked individuals who'd forgotten why they were fighting. Ichigo knelt in blood-soaked dirt, watching it happen through vision that blurred at the edges. Watching the tower of Barad-dûr, the dark tower itself, crack from base to summit, watching it fall. The collapse took minutes, but felt like hours. Stone and iron and malice made solid, all tumbling down in clouds of dust that rose to blot out the sky. When the thunder of its fall finally faded, silence rushed in to fill the void. No one moved. No one spoke. 7,000 men stood staring at the wasteland where their enemy's heart had been unable to process that it was over. Gandalf's staff hit the ground. Once, the sound breaking the spell. "The ring is destroyed," he said, wonder and exhaustion mixing in equal measure. "Frodo has succeeded. The war is won." The cheer that rose should have been deafening, should have been triumphant. Instead, it came quiet, disbelieving the sound of men who'd accepted death and now had to learn how to live again. Aragorn found Ichigo still kneeling, pulled him to his feet with hands that shook from exhaustion and relief. "You held," the ranger said simply. "When it mattered most, you held his attention. Gave Frodo the time he needed." Ichigo nodded. Couldn't manage words. His mind still felt raw, scraped hollow by the eye's attention. The visions hadn't been lies. Gandalf had fallen. Boromir had died. The kid at Helm's Deep would carry scars forever. But they'd won. Against impossible odds and overwhelming power, they'd won. Not because of strength. Not because of any single blade or single fighter. Because two hobbits had carried a burden to its end while everyone else stood in the way of what wanted to stop them. Ichigo looked at Zangetsu, at the blade covered in blood and ash, at the weapon that had cut through thousands but solved nothing by itself. The eye had marked him, left scars that would never fully heal. Even now, hours after its attention had withdrawn, he felt phantom traces of that pressure, that certainty of being watched. It would fade. Eventually. Or it wouldn't. Either way, he'd carry it. The cost of standing between people and what wanted them dead. Eagles came at sunset. Great birds larger than houses bearing Frodo and Sam from the mountain where they'd completed what armies couldn't. Watching them arrive. Watching the hobbits who'd saved the world being carried to safety. Ichigo finally let himself believe it. It was over. The war was done. And somehow, against all logic and probability, he'd survived to see it. Chapter 8. After the Ring. The coronation lasted 3 days. Minas Tirith had rebuilt faster than seemed possible, stone replacing char banners flying where smoke had risen. The White City remembered how to be white again. People filled streets that had been empty, their voices carrying songs instead of screams. Spring came early to Gondor, as if the land itself wanted to forget winter. Aragorn stood before thousands, crowned King of Gondor and Arnor, the line of kings restored after centuries of stewards. He wore the crown with the weight of someone who'd earned it through miles walked and battles survived, not through birthright alone. Ichigo watched from the back of the crowd, far enough away that no one would think to include him in ceremonies meant for heroes of this world. Close enough to see Frodo and Sam honored, to watch the hobbits who'd saved everything receive recognition they'd never sought. They looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but diminished by what they'd carried, by the weight they'd finally set down. Frodo especially seemed translucent, as if part of him had burned away on that mountain and never quite returned. Gandalf had explained it during the journey back from Mordor. The ring didn't just corrupt, it consumed. Took pieces of whoever bore it and never gave them back. Frodo would heal in time, but some wounds went too deep for even time to fully erase. Ichigo understood. He still felt the eye's attention sometimes, phantom pressure that made his hands shake and his breath catch. The mark it had left went deeper than flesh, carved into whatever passed for a soul in someone who existed between worlds. But he was here, alive, whole enough. That night after the ceremonies ended and the celebrations began, Aragorn found him on a balcony overlooking the city. The new king moved quietly despite his armor, carrying 2 cups of wine that probably cost more than Ichigo had ever owned. "You didn't stay for the feast," Aragorn said, offering 1 cup. Ichigo accepted it, but didn't drink. "Not my place. You fought at Helm's Deep, at Pelennor, at the Black Gate itself. You bled for this city. That earns you a place." "Does it?" Ichigo gestured toward the celebration below, where soldiers drank and laughed and tried to forget what they'd seen. "They're grateful, but they still flinch when I get too close. Still look at me like I might be the next thing they have to fight." Aragorn leaned against the railing, his silence acknowledgement enough. "I don't belong here," Ichigo continued. "Never did. Showed up by accident, fought because that's what I do, and now—" He trailed off the rest, too obvious to say. "Now the war is over, and you don't know what comes next." Aragorn sipped his wine. "I spent years wondering the same thing. Whether I belonged anywhere. Whether being useful was the same as having a home. You found yours? Because I was born to it. You weren't. This world didn't make space for you because it couldn't. You carved your own space with every battle, every choice to stand when standing meant bleeding." The king turned to face him directly. "That's worth more than any crown." Ichigo finally drank. The wine tasted of grapes and something else, something that might have been hope, if hope had a flavor. "What will you do?" Aragorn asked. "Leave, eventually." The words came easier than expected. "This is your peace. Your rebuilding. I'm a weapon that worked because there was a war. Now that there isn't—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Aragorn nodded slowly, understanding in the way only someone who'd lived between worlds could. "Where will you go?" "Don't know. Maybe I'll find my way home. Maybe there's another ford somewhere with people who need someone standing between them and whatever comes next." Ichigo touched Zangetsu's hilt, the blade that had traveled so far from where it was forged. "Somewhere that needs what I am instead of fearing it." The king extended his hand, not as a king to a subject, as one warrior to another. "Then go with my gratitude, and know that if legends speak of a stranger who came when darkness fell and left when light returned, they'll speak true." Ichigo took the hand, gripped it firm, let it go. Some goodbyes didn't need more than that. He left Minas Tirith 3 days later, in the gray hour before dawn, when the city still slept. No fanfare, no escort. Just Zangetsu across his shoulders and clothes that had been mended more times than he could count. Gandalf waited at the gate. The wizard leaned on his staff robes, bright even in pre-dawn gloom, as if he'd known exactly when Ichigo would choose to slip away. "Leaving without saying farewell?" The wizard's tone carried amusement rather than reproach. Thought about it. Figured you'd be here anyway. Quite right. Gandalf produced a pipe from somewhere, began packing it, with the unhurried movements of someone for whom time meant different things. You learned well. Better than I hoped when you first arrived at that ford, all edges and instinct. Learned that strength solves less than I thought. That sometimes the best thing you can do is buy time for someone else to matter. Yes, though I suspect you'll forget that lesson several times before it truly sticks. The wizard lit his pipe, breathed smoke that smelled of autumn and roads not yet traveled. We all do. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky lighten degree by degree. Finally, Gandalf spoke again. The paths between worlds are strange things, tangled, unpredictable. I cannot promise you'll find your way home. But I can tell you this, whatever road you walk, you'll walk it as someone who stood when standing mattered. That's a small thing to carry. And everything. Ichigo nodded. Turned to go. Ichigo. He paused. Thank you. For Moria. For all of it. Simple words, but carrying weight that made Ichigo's throat tight. He left without answering. Some things were too big for words anyway. The road took him north, then east, following paths that existed more in feeling than on any map. He walked for weeks through lands already beginning to heal. Forests where darkness had ruled now showed green shoots. Rivers ran clear where they'd been choked with ash. The world remembering how to be whole. He passed through villages where people stared and whispered. Some recognized him from battles. Others just sensed something other walking through their midst. He never stayed long, never tried to explain. Eventually, the path led him back to the ford. The same stretch of water where he'd woken, where Nazgul had first felt Zangetsu's edge, where everything began. The water ran clear now. Birds sang. The air tasted clean. He stood there for a long time, feeling for the thing that had brought him. The tear between worlds, the accident of transit that had dumped him in Middle-earth with no warning and no map home. Nothing. Just wind and water and the ordinary peace of a place that had forgotten war. Maybe there was no way back. Maybe the door had closed when Sauron fell, when the architecture of this world shifted and paths that had existed ceased to. Or maybe he just hadn't found it yet. Ichigo adjusted Zangetsu and kept walking. East toward lands he'd never seen, toward possibilities that existed beyond maps, drawn by people who thought they knew where the world ended. If there was a way home, he'd find it. If there wasn't, he'd make do. Find another ford, another group of people who needed someone willing to stand. Same as always. Years later, in the archives of Minas Tirith, a scholar would find mention of him in the Chronicles of the War of the Ring. A brief entry, no more than a paragraph, noting the presence of a stranger who'd fought at Helm's Deep and Pelennor and the Black Gate itself. The entry called him by different names, depending on who'd recorded the memory. The Storm, the Black Blade, the outsider who stood. Some accounts claimed he'd been a wizard, others a warrior from distant lands. A few even suggested he'd been Maya in disguise, sent by powers beyond mortal understanding, to tip the balance when darkness pressed hardest. None knew for certain. None could agree on details. But all mentioned the blade large and black, and the way space seemed to fold when he moved. All noted that he'd appeared when needed and vanished when the war ended. The scholar reading this would wonder. Would spend years searching for more information, for corroboration, for anything that might explain who this stranger had truly been. Would find nothing. And eventually would close the book and accept that some questions answer themselves by remaining unanswered. That some mysteries serve better as mysteries than as facts pinned to pages. Middle-earth moved forward. The Fourth Age began. Kings ruled and kingdoms prospered, and the shadow that had hung over everything lifted to reveal a world that remembered how to hope. In that world, the stranger who'd walked through war became story, then legend, then something less than legend, but more than forgotten, a footnote in histories too vast to hold every truth. Somewhere, walking roads that existed between the cracks of maps, a young man with orange hair and an oversized blade continued forward, searching for home, finding pieces of it in moments where people needed protection and someone was willing to provide it, learning slowly that belonging wasn't about finding the right place. It was about choosing to stand when standing mattered, and letting that be enough. The world turned. Seasons changed. Wars ended and new ones began, as they always did. And in all of it, written in languages that would be forgotten and remembered and forgotten again. A simple truth remained. Some battles are won with steel. Some with sacrifice. Some with the simple refusal to let darkness have the final word. And all of them, every single one, are written in the same ink. Blood and choice. Blood.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss out future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.